Hello, everyone. Welcome into today's webinar, Influencing Without Authority, presented by our Director of Leadership Training Solutions at Watermark Learning, Andrea Brockmeyer. My name is Mariela Salinas, and I will be assisting and moderating our session today. We are in Zoom for today's webinar, and we will be sharing a copy of this recording with you in an email after the webinar. We do encourage participation throughout the session, so please use that chat or the Q&A option for our short Q&A after the presentation. Educate 360 is so excited to present this webinar today. So without further ado, I will hand it over to you, Andrea.
Thank you so much, Mariela, and everybody, welcome. Thanks so much for taking some time out of your busy day to spend it here with us. It's great to be here to talk with you about influencing without authority, cultivating influence to drive organizational excellence. That subtitle is significant. It reflects a change in thinking I've had about this whole topic, which I'll get to. So, oh wow, Texas, Nebraska, Colorado, we're just all up and down the. Wow, I was gonna say there we're sort of central Arizona. Great to see everybody, and the sun is shining, just so you know, here in beautiful Minneapolis. So welcome, welcome everybody from everywhere. All right, so always fun to start with a little poll just to get your head in the game here. So on a typical day, how much of your time do you spend trying to influence without authority? Take a stab, throw something in there, Mariela. Are you going to run that? There we go. I can never remember if that's a you or me thing. So go ahead, and you should see the poll there on your screen. Share your thoughts.
I'll give us about 20 more seconds just so we can have a nice group, but the responses are coming in. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, and it does say typical workday. Okay, Grandma, great. Go ahead and pop that into the poll there if you can.
Alrighty, I'll end it, and here are the results.
All right. So, wow, somebody at 100%. Yeah. You know, we've got quite a few in the 76 to 99, 51 to 75, lots in the 26 to 50. So once we talk about this today, it'll be interesting to see if your thoughts change a little bit. Maybe you up those numbers somewhat. But that's great. Lots of influencing going on among all of us here today. So what do we mean by influence anyways? So just a couple of sort of definitions to get under our belt here. Influence and persuasion, two very similar, somewhat just a tiny distinction there. Influence being the power or the ability of someone or something to have some impact on how somebody thinks or what somebody's doing or how somebody feels. And actually, you really need to hit on all three of those: what they think, how they feel, and what they do in order to have sustained impact. So it's, you know, getting somebody to think, feel, do something different than what they're doing right now. Okay. Persuasion, kind of a maybe a type of influence. It's where you're using communication deliberately to change how somebody thinks or what they're doing or how they're feeling. So whether written or verbal, it's using some kind of communication. So it's maybe the sales pitch, right? Influence, on the other hand, could be role modeling. You can even influence unintentionally, right? Parents certainly know that. But you can, you know, or think about the burden of celebrity when people are celebrities and they're doing something and everybody mimics them. And that's not their intention. They're just out doing their thing. But because of who they are, they influence. Persuasion, on the other hand, is specifically telling somebody in some way to do something. Okay, so I might influence somebody to work really hard on a project by role modeling that and just making sure that they can see that I'm doing those things. I might persuade them by telling them the benefits of working really hard on a project, just as an example. So sports always, I think, provides a way of understanding this, many things actually. Sports is a fun metaphor. Everybody's got, usually people have some kind of activity that they enjoy watching. Um, and so you think about sports and influencing without authority. You think about the coaches, the great coaches that we've had throughout history that we have now. And, they've got all the authority, of course. I mean, they are the coach, right? But do people do what they do? I mean, do people, how influential are they? How, in terms of sort of the broad perspective that we have out there and, out in the world. Um, compare that to the people that they're coaching, compare that to the players. Where's the real influence? It's the people who are on the field, right? Those are the ones that people dress like, that the ones that people emulate, the ones that get invited to the late shows and that kind of thing. So this concept of influencing without authority, you see it play out in all sorts of fun ways, I think. Sports being one of them. Influence comes from someone who has higher authority. Well, or not, right? So the players here don't have the authority, but they certainly have the influence. Um, and persuasion is needed by someone who has less or no authority. I don't know. I mean, I think that's an interesting thought, Shiraz, but I think, if you kind of think about that a little bit, not necessarily. Um, if you think about where do we need to influence? If you're in an organization and you've got levels and you've got a hierarchy of some kind, you've got some people are in senior positions, some folks that are in lower level positions. Where do we need to influence? Well, certainly many of us need to influence up, right? We need to get people to think, feel, do things at a higher level than we're at, right? And that's a different task than the idea of influencing out, influencing our peers or our colleagues. But what about the idea of influencing down? And I think this speaks directly to your point, Shra. Do people at the top need to be able to influence? Because I said so, that's why. That doesn't work too well in organizations these days. There aren't too many people who are looking to get their foot in the door at a company because there's a lot of top down hierarchy. That's really doesn't fly too well anymore. People at the top do need to influence, right? Because even though they've got the authority, how effective are you when you rely on authority to get something done? Are you going to have people more enthusiastic, more supportive, more engaged when you can get them to do something because they want to, or when you can get them to do something because you said so, because you have higher authority? I would guess that if you ask people at the top of your organization, do you have to influence or do you rely entirely on authority? I'll bet you might be surprised to find out how much they have to influence, right? So, and if you think about it, this really makes sense in terms of other things that are going on in our world, in our organizational world, and our work worlds. This flattening of hierarchies in organization, that's certainly been going on for many years. But I think you see it increasing, and you talk about, the challenge around engagement, the challenge around getting people to take ownership. I can't tell you how many times I've gone in to do some kind of, say project related training, project management, and people say, we've got these project managers and we tell them they're empowered. We try to empower them, but they won't take it. They don't want PMs to rely on hierarchy. They want them to own it. And so you've got to, I've been in organizations where they struggle, for example, to find executive sponsors for their projects because they only have two levels. So certainly there's been less emphasis on hierarchy in organizations. I would also suggest that what impact has Agile, or I'd throw that out there for you to consider, what impact has Agile had on the need to influence? So, how many of you are working in an Agile environment or an environment that's partly Agile and maybe something else? You've got some sort of Agile influence in your environment. How do things get done in an Agile environment? Well, it's not by somebody marching around telling people what to do. I'm pretty sure that's the case, right? You're talking about self-organizing teams. You're talking about team members who are accountable to each other. And I think to the extent that agile is something that people are embracing in order to get project and organizational agility, that doesn't happen by, yeah, it's heavy communication, exactly. And it's a lot of, teams that rely on each other and, co-creating, collaborating, all of that kind of thing. So I think that has driven sort of the reliance on authority and increased the reliance on influence considerably. Does taking ownership mean you have authority, or is that why PMs don't want it when it's ownership with no authority and support from those with authority? Well, why don't people want ownership? Why? And I would suggest, do people really want to influence? I'm going to plant that little seed for you, and think about that. Do you really want to be able to get people to do things that they're not currently doing, think and feel things they're not currently thinking? Is there not ownership that, or authority doesn't necessarily come with that, but certainly accountability does, right? If you're not influential, the waters stay calm. Being influential means coming in and, making waves a little bit. I mean, changing things up. Is that really what you want? I mean, it's a lot easier, is it not, to just sort of stay under the radar and come in and just kind of ease out every day? Think about people that you think of that are really influential. I mean, they're not just, somebody that people don't pay attention to. Those are people that have a lot of political clout, not to be confused with authority, right? I mean, and the other thing to think about is, as we think about these sort of big picture changes that are going on, what is it? How important is authority in much of our world? Think about social media. Where is the authority in social media? I mean, there isn't any. For all intents and purposes, when you're out there, I mean, surely there are sort of presumably some reins on what happens on these forums and that kind of thing. But it's not like there's people out there that you can see sort of making decisions about what happens. I mean, we engage in influence, um, invite influence every day just by engaging in social media, which, as hard as you might try, is pretty hard to avoid these days. So, I think even in that way, influence, well, yeah, I'm looking for it every day, right? I'm trying to be influenced every day. It's certainly the ability to influence has never been easier. If you want to be an influencer, go on and say something, do something, record it. I mean, it's never been easier. And like I say, I think that in many ways we're inviting others to influence every time we look at review, right? I do it. I don't, how am I going to figure out which is the best thingamajig to get? Well, I'm going to read reviews, look around, and really that's an invitation to be influenced. So you just think about this whole, if you think of sort of old models where there were authorities and that we looked for those authorities and we, relied on those, and we sort of, when metaphorically looking up to these authorities, things, it's a lot more flow these days in terms of how we get our information and make decisions in organizations and just in general, right? So what are the barriers then? If I think about, well, certainly it should be easier to influence than it used to be. Perhaps there's lots of opportunity to do that. What gets in the way of me being as influential as I could be? What are some things that impede my ability to influence? They usually have support from those with authority. Okay, I'm just going to go back here and take a look at some of these. Well, so that's an interesting observation, right? Because if you're thinking PMs don't want it when it's ownership with no authority or support from those with authority, they usually, well, this is the thing, right? I mean, I think that, and who is this? Tatiana. So if you think about, if I need people to take ownership for something, um, this is what I'm hearing. It isn't a matter of just saying take ownership for this. You need to support them, right? You need to influence them to do that. They need to believe that you are going to support them. That's how you're going to get that. I think those things go hand in hand, and that really speaks to the idea that it isn't, you can't dictate to that to somebody. You're going to be a lot more effective if you influence them to do that, right? Um, Brenda, I don't know. The meaning of the word influence is different among professionals depending on their career stage. I think there are some, mm, I think the way people influence evolves with a career. I think the interest in influencing evolves um, as people, mature in their career. I'm not sure that the meaning of the word, the value proposition of influence is very different early in your career than it is later on, I think. And that's a personal thing, but I think that's always such an interesting concept is how do, when we talk about leadership, whether it's influencing, negotiating, just navigating political landscapes, all of those kinds of things, that is such an interesting uh, thing to think about is how do those things evolve throughout someone's career. And it's all good. It's just you've got a different lens you're looking through and different value type things that you're looking for. Yeah. Title for buying. Micromanagers. Oh, I'm not keeping up quick enough here for these comments. I'm sorry, you guys. I don't know. I'm not sure what you're responding to. There is so much information to sift through. Information or influence can be difficult to achieve. Yeah, we talk about that in our class. It's really good you got to have a goal specifically in mind. I think people think they just in general want to be more influential. You're going to be a lot more effective if you think about a goal specifically. You have to, because there is just so much. People with the purse strings, Michael. Right, right. Well, I think about their accountability, right? They've got to answer to people, and that can be tough. Yeah, style matters. Back to Shiraz. Yeah, yeah, exactly. Right. Your level of expertise. Yep. Yeah, sure. There are various levels of influence. Some people are just influential. They walk in the room and heads turn. Other people are maybe more early in their development of their influencing skills, for sure. Yeah, absolutely. Um, so things that can get in the way, I mean, to that point, things that can get in the way of influencing is lack of confidence. Again, think of somebody you think of that's really influential. These are not sheepish people that kind of run around and kick the ground. They're looking down. These are people that are, heads up and very confident, right? It takes time to influence. This is one of the big ahas in class is, I had somebody one time say, they took that influencing class and they said, well, I thought we were just going to learn a bunch of one-liners to use in meetings. That is not influence. Influence takes time. It's something you have to cultivate. There are different elements of it that you have to put together. The other thing is corporate culture. So some organizations, even though I think in general things are flattening, I think we see that there are still some organizations that have more hierarchy, or the levels that they do have, there's more rigidity there. I've been in organizations where an open door meant if the door's open, no matter who it is, it could be the CEO, you can go in and talk to them, and they'll make you feel like you're the only thing they have to listen to at that moment. Other places where there was an open door policy, and if the door was open, well, maybe you could go in or maybe not. You never really knew, kind of thing. You do not talk to somebody that is one level above you. You get smacked down pretty fast. Those kinds of things. And here's my thinking that has evolved around this whole idea of influence. People come to an influencing class thinking from an individual perspective, I want to be able to influence. I think organizations need to think about how do they cultivate an environment where everybody is influencing, because we don't have time for people to wait for permission and go through chains of command and protocols and those kinds of things in many instances. If you have what it takes to influence, which is a high level of trust, and you've got people who take time to understand each other, respect each other's styles and differences, and people who have the courage to go out there and try to make things happen and try to get consensus around things that are good for the organization and good for the project and good for the people in them. That's where you get really great organizations that can do great things. And that really contributes, I would suggest, to agility. I would say that it promotes engagement when people feel like they have some agency over how things get done and what gets done. This is where they'll take ownership for things because they know they have that support. This is where you get emergent leadership. You get good decision making. Have you ever worked in organizations where nobody can make a decision? Things just swirl. People are afraid to step up and do something. Where you get people who develop communication skills because you have to, at some point, communicate and help people understand what it is that you're suggesting. You have to experiment with different ways of communicating to resonate with people with different styles. We don't all communicate in the same way. We might all use the same language, be it, whether it's Swahili or Swedish or whatever, or if it's business language, technical language, whatever it is. But you need to be able to connect with the people that you're communicating with. Oops. Creativity and innovation. How do people try out ideas? Tell me that's not an example of influence. When you throw something out to somebody and say, hey, what do you think of this? Yeah, that's influence. We call it planting seed, right? You get people that have the courage and are comfortable suggesting an idea, maybe to somebody that reports to them, maybe to a peer or a colleague, maybe to somebody up, right? Change management, as organizations are going through changes constantly, how do we get people to talk about the change that's going on, how it's impacting them, to be transparent about those kinds of things, to take all these other things here that we're talking about, to make that change tolerable, to make it easier, to make it constructive and valuable, to make sure that we're getting everything out of those changes that we need. So I think that's something that organizations should think about, is we want a high influence organization where we're getting people to think things, feel things, do things differently. This doesn't mean we throw protocols out the window. This doesn't mean that there aren't any decision makers, or that there are some people where that have the purse strings that don't have a say. But that's part of the richness. Think of those environments where these kinds of things here, these bullet points happen. There's a lot of influence going on there. That's really what it is. So what does it take to influence? Well, it takes trust. That is foundational. You have to have trust. And so you can think about, how do I build trust with the people around me? How do I build trust with colleagues, with coworkers, with stakeholders? I need to think about that. Are these things that I see happening? Are these things that I do? Because if all I see are trust busters, you do not have an environment where influence is going to be really possible. What happens if you don't trust somebody? It's like a wall goes up, right? When you see somebody coming to you that you don't trust, you're not really listening. You're not open to their suggestions, be it explicit or just sharing ideas. You need to have trust, right? And we say that about so many things, but it's really true. And that's where you get all the energy and the engagement as well. So there's just a lot of benefit to organizations that are intentional about paying attention to trust, and how do we build that in our environment. The other thing is thinking strategically. What is it that if you think of influence as an exchange, reciprocity exchange, those were concepts that Cohen and Bradford, who are thought leaders in influence, they talked about, that there's an exchange going on, right? I want you to think, feel, do something different. The question that I have to be asking is, what do I have to offer you? So what are their interests? What's in it for them? What are the tactics that are going to work most effectively for this person that I'm trying to influence? I have to think about those things. I'm not going to influence everybody in the same way. That's why it takes time. And that's again, if you think about those people you know that are really influential, they do not interact with the same person in every way. That's not being dishonest. That's being strategic. That's being mindful. That's being respectful. Meet people where they're at. That's how you're going to be effective with this. And then what do you have in your back pocket that's of interest to somebody? Is maybe it's prestige, maybe it's being a part of something that's kind of a high profile thing, maybe it's being connected to something that they would see a value, maybe it's giving somebody exposure to the right people. That's where that point earlier, does the definition of influence change as you go throughout your career? No, but the value of it changes, right? And depending on where you're at in your career, maybe you want to be seen by the right people. Maybe getting invited to the right meetings and being at the right table is important at different points. Time or space, resources, those might be things. Are those things that you could offer in some way in exchange? And those are just a few examples. And then there are different techniques there, and we talk about these as sort of discrete techniques, but really it's a soup of techniques that you experiment with and use depending on the context you find yourself in. Rational persuasion, I'm sure all of you have used that, right? We need to do this because the return on investment is this, and because it's going to improve things by this much, and we've got metrics, all that kind of thing. Ingratiation, making yourself more likable to someone. There are some very unpleasant euphemisms for the idea of ingratiation. I have classes where people won't even own up to it. Oh, I would never ingratiate myself to someone. We all ingratiate ourselves to people. Remember, golf courses are full of people that don't all necessarily love the game of golf. There's all sorts of reasons to golf. Building a coalition, getting people on board. Interesting ways that you can do that. A lot of different ways that can be used in organization. Again, just a few techniques that we talk about. And once you have an idea and you recognize these as techniques, that helps you be more strategic and intentional about how you might influence, because you're going to recognize things that you're already doing because you feel the need to do them. But if you're like, ooh, this is what I'm doing, you can be a little more refined, perhaps, a little more effective, maybe. The other thing it takes to influence is courage. As I said, influence is making waves in one way or another. Sometimes they're big waves, sometimes maybe not so big. But influence is not just staying under the radar and just leaving things as they are. So when you influence, you need courage. It might not work. Maybe I put myself out there. I talk to people I wouldn't normally talk to. I kind of get out of my comfort zone and it didn't work. Maybe I feel a little exposed. That's true. That could happen. The other thing is it might work. Woo, I got somebody to do something. I got the organization to move in a little different direction. It's not like job over. Now it's like you just started. Now you've got all the follow up to do with that. Now you're perceived as being more influential. People may seek you out. You've got a little higher profile, right? So it takes courage to influence. So here's the thing. You all have what you need. You've got the ability to build trust. You've got the ability to be strategic. You can muster the courage somehow. Everybody has what they need. They have it within them to be an effective influencer. So go for it. All right. Thank you, folks. We'd love to help you out with honing your influencing skills, any other leadership skills, technical skills, project management, business analysis, certifications of any kind. Check us out, E3 Educate 360, our family of brands. We'd love to help you. And join us for our next Influencing Without Authority class. We've got one seat left, as I understand it, in our June 27th class. And we've got others on the calendar too. So thanks so much. And thanks for your comments, everybody. That was awesome. Happy to stick around. Look me up on LinkedIn. I'd love to be connected with you. And thanks again for your time today, folks. Really appreciate it.
Likewise, everyone, thanks so much for joining us and thank you so much for your engagement. And of course, thank you so much, Andrea, for your amazing insight today.
Yeah, you bet.
Alrighty, if you want any more info on this topic, do not be afraid to visit us at watermarklearning.com or click that link I dropped in the chat. And if you missed out on any part of this session, we will be sharing a copy with all of you in a recording and an email after the webinar. Thanks for joining us again, everyone, and bye for now.
Bye bye.